She got a ticket one day after her husband's funeral. And what this judge did next broke the courtroom. The woman stood alone at the front of the courtroom, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She was simply trying to stay upright, trying to keep herself together long enough to speak. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, not just that morning, but from nights that had blurred into one another. Sleep had not come easily. When it did, it brought memories she wasn't ready to relive. When she woke, reality hit even harder. Her voice trembled as she began to explain her situation. Not because she was angry, not because she felt wronged by the system, but because speaking the words out loud made everything feel real again. Just one day earlier, she had buried her husband, the person she had built her life around, the person she shared her home with, the person whose absence now filled every quiet corner of her world. There had been no time to process it, no space to grieve properly. One moment she was standing at a graveside, surrounded by family, holding back tears as the earth was lowered. The next, she was standing in a courtroom, being asked to explain a mistake. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might cause her to fall apart completely. She explained that in the days leading up to the funeral, nothing had felt normal. Time didn't move the way it used to. Simple tasks felt overwhelming. Dates and deadlines blurred together. Letters went unopened. Appointments were forgotten. In the middle of planning a funeral, comforting loved ones, and trying to survive the shock of sudden loss, she had missed a court date. There was no excuse in her voice, no attempt to shift blame, no argument about the rule itself, just an explanation. That missed court date had turned into a ticket. That ticket had turned into a fine. And that fine now sat in front of her like another weight she didn't know how to carry. She admitted openly that she hadn't even thought about money in those days. Bills, deadlines, notices. None of it registered. Grief had taken up all the space in her mind. Survival mode had taken over. As she spoke, the courtroom grew quieter with every sentence. Chairs stopped shifting. Papers stopped rustling. Even the usual background noise of a busy court seemed to fade away. People weren't listening like they normally did. They weren't waiting for their turn or glancing at the clock. They were listening because they felt something familiar in her words. Loss. Confusion. That heavy fog that grief brings, where even the strongest people struggle to function. She paused more than once, pressing her lips together, steadying her breath. At one point, she lifted her hand to her face, as if to stop the tears before they escaped. It wasn't a performance. It was a reflex, a quiet attempt to maintain dignity in a moment where everything inside her felt fragile. She didn't ask for mercy. She didn't say the fine was unfair. She simply explained what had happened and then fell silent. That silence was heavy. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles when people collectively realize they are witnessing something real, something human. Slowly, almost instinctively, every eye in the room shifted toward the bench, toward Judge Frank Caprio. He hadn't interrupted her. He hadn't rushed her. He hadn't shown frustration or impatience. He listened. As she finished speaking, he looked down at the paperwork in front of him, reviewing the case details. On paper, it was simple. A missed date, a ticket, a fine. The kind of case the court saw dozens of times a day. But what stood in front of him wasn't just a case number. It was a woman standing in the aftermath of loss, trying to navigate a system while her world was still falling apart. The courtroom waited, not for a ruling yet, not for a decision, but for a response. Because everyone in that room could feel it. This moment was no longer just about a ticket. It was about whether the system could recognize the weight of grief and whether justice could make room for humanity. Judge Caprio lifted his gaze from the paperwork, and that's when the room held its breath. Judge Frank Caprio didn't speak right away. For a brief moment, the courtroom stayed frozen in the silence that followed the woman's explanation. It wasn't the kind of pause people notice on a clock. It was the kind that stretches because no one wants to interrupt it. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his glasses. That single movement changed the atmosphere in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't deliberate, but it signaled something deeper than procedure. It was the pause of a man who wasn't just reviewing a case, but reflecting on what he had just heard. He looked down, not at the paperwork, not at the fine amount. He looked down as if collecting his thoughts, giving himself a second to respond with care, rather than routine. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, low enough that people leaned forward without realizing it. I understand what grief does to people. There was no lecture in his tone, no explanation of policy, no reminder of consequences, just understanding. That sentence landed heavier than any ruling could have, because it acknowledged something courts don't often say out loud. That grief isn't orderly. It doesn't respect schedules, deadlines, or procedures. It disrupts memory. It steals focus. It turns simple responsibilities into overwhelming obstacles. Judge Caprio explained that the law gives judges discretion for a reason, not to bend rules without purpose, but to recognize moments where strict enforcement would serve no justice at all. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform for the room. He spoke like someone who had seen enough life to know that sometimes compassion is the most responsible decision. Then he made his ruling. The fine was dismissed. No conditions, no warnings, no additional penalties. Just dismissed. The law hadn't disappeared. The rules still existed. But in that moment, it stepped aside to make room for humanity. The woman didn't react right away. For a split second, it looked like she hadn't fully processed what she'd just heard. Then her hand rose to her mouth, instinctively covering it as tears finally escaped. Not loud, not dramatic, just relief. Relief that someone had listened. Relief that the weight she was carrying had been lightened, even if only slightly. Relief that, on one of the hardest weeks of her life, the system hadn't added more pain. Judge Caprio turned away briefly. He lifted his hand to his face and wiped his eyes. It wasn't for show. It wasn't something he seemed aware of in the moment. It was human. That small gesture said more than words could. It reminded everyone in the room that judges don't operate outside of life. They bring their own experiences, their own losses, their own understanding into the courtroom. No one clapped. No one spoke. The courtroom didn't erupt with emotion. It stayed quiet, but wasn't the same silence as before. This silence felt settled, reflective. People weren't thinking about the fine anymore. They were thinking about their own lives, about the moments when grief had made them forgetful, overwhelmed, barely functional, about how easily anyone could find themselves standing in that same spot. What unfolded in that courtroom wasn't a rejection of the law. It was the law doing exactly what it was meant to do: serve people. As the case concluded and the court prepared to move on, something lingered in the room. A reminder that justice doesn't always need to be loud to be powerful. That fairness isn't measured only in enforcement, but in understanding. That day, no precedent was set. No statute was rewritten. But something more important happened. People walked out remembering that the justice system, when guided by empathy, can still recognize the person behind the paperwork. And that sometimes the most meaningful rulings are the ones that acknowledge pain, ease a burden, and allow someone the space to heal. Because justice at its best isn't just about rules. Sometimes it's simply about being human.